medical imaging studies are a substantial cause of health problems. And CT scans are perhaps the worst culprit because your exposure to radiation is much, much higher than a simple plain X-ray. But even ultrasounds can potentially cause health problems.
This is the True Health Report, where critical appraisal fuels true freedom.
So today's topic is really foundational, and it's kind of understanding the context for the cause of much of the illness that we face in modern society. And it's all about the toxins that we're exposed to. So in today's program, Minimizing Toxins, I'm going to introduce you to a sample of all the things that we're exposed to and how they get into our bodies. And it can be a little overwhelming. However, know that you can still attain and maintain an excellent state of health despite all of these adversarial aspects of the situation. So I'm going to spatter in throughout the presentation ways that you can do things a little bit differently, how you can minimize your exposure to a variety of these toxins. And I'm going to also conclude with some more suggestions like that. And also, I'm going to help you understand how these toxins actually contribute to health problems and a little bit of the evidence for that, which is only in the infantile stages, but it's still quite significant. So we have here Global Healing Center made a report that every day we may be exposed to as many as 2.1 million distinct and unique toxic chemicals each and every day. And of course, here are many of the types of symptoms that can result from a variety of toxins. So here is an excellent resource to help you with consumer products. So the Environmental Working Group, who does a lot of good research about not only hygiene products, but also food and other topics, and I might hint at their research later. They have this app that you can download on your device, and you can look up different categories of products, or you can look at individual products and it will identify the problematic ingredients. And they do give a green seal to many products that they say essentially contain no harmful chemicals. So it's very useful. Even things like cosmetics, makeup, hygiene products, toothpaste, hair products, etc., are all in here. So if you need to use some of those things, you can at least find ones that are relatively safe. And EWG also has brought us the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15, which are a good resource for identifying which fresh fruits and vegetables have the most pesticides and herbicides. So I'm going to introduce a variety of different types of environmental toxins that we're exposed to, and endocrine disrupting chemicals is one of the classes that is quite significant because it's associated with a lot of health conditions, and these materials are quite pervasive. And so here you can see from the diagram various endocrine systems that can be affected, such as our regulation of metabolism, regulation of our body weight, thyroid function, and sexual functioning. And there are many xenoestrogens, for example, that are present in various types of contaminants. And if we go to the next slide, we can see some particular examples. So parabens are a big one. Triclosan is a material that has been used a lot in toothpaste, for example. It's said to be, I believe, an antibacterial type agent. And you can see that it can have the effect on male fertility and other problems. We see phthalates is another, and bisphenols like BPA. But even if a product advertises that they're BPA free, they likely have other bisphenols like B, C, or D, which may have similar toxicity. So this really is plastics that are the problem. Many of these compounds are plasticizing chemicals. So for example, if you microwave food in plastic containers or wraps like a lot of frozen foods come with, then you can leach these xenoestrogens into the food, and that's one of the most potent sources. Indoor air pollution is something that many of us overlook, but it is a main source of pollution. And of course, this gets in through our skin and our lungs. And you can see there are many, many sources of this type of pollution. Now, on these slides, which I borrowed from other aspects, it might mention some things related to germ theory here, so we can just set those aside and look at the problems. Now, on the next slide, it gives a little bit more information about the particular sources of indoor air pollution, right? So we see, for example, things like chemicals we may use, fragrances, cleaning products, furniture, varnishes, carpet, upholstery, wallpaper, paint, right? All of these things off gas a lot of volatile compounds that we'll be exposed to. Now, in new buildings, newer construction, there are many other types of synthetic materials that are used, which are different from, in the past when they had stone foundations and, wood stick frames. So these are things to be cautious of. And of course, they decrease over time as the building ages and as the furniture and other things. So be very cautious when you move into new construction or when you buy new furniture or do some remodeling. So here's an example of a substance, atrazine, which is a pesticide used in agriculture. And it was found by a researcher initially at Berkeley University that it essentially disrupts sexual functioning in amphibians. And there was a movement to get the EPA to study this and to regulate it. Of course, they denied, but you can see that the effect has been observed and judged to be significant, although it's still an unregulated product. So here's an example of some cosmetic type products, right? We're talking about fragrances, perfumes, and colognes that have a number of toxic chemicals in them, right? So it's not just alcohol and a fragrance, which may be okay if it was regular ethanol, but here we have a variety of toxic compounds, benzaldehyde, camphor, ethyl acetate, benzyl acetate, linalool acetone, and methylene chloride, which is an organic solvent. And if we look on the next slide, one of the things I encourage you to do to learn about some of these products that may be already in your household that you've been exposed to is to find the material safety data sheet or MSDS. And this is something that is required by federal law for every chemical. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that there's actually toxicology studies or data behind the chemical, but at least there has to be some evidence about it that tells you, how to store it, what kind of safety precautions you need to handle it. Now, here we're talking about acetone, which is a very common chemical. It's also a solvent. It's a ketone, and it's used in products like nail polish remover, for example, and some of the fragrances. And you can see that it definitely has toxicity, especially with an acute poisoning, with inhalation and such. But at low levels, it may not be nearly as toxic as some of the other compounds, but it's good to at least have this kind of information so you know what is the most harmful. So we're talking about toxins in the home, and I'm going to give you some ways to identify some of these things and then some ways you can mitigate your exposure. So, of course, hygiene and beauty products are quite a big deal. And one of my healthy living live streams, in fact, the first episode is on that. And carrot seed. Now, if you don't actually need sunscreen for most of the time, if you're very fair skinned and you're going to have a lot of exposure during the peak sunlight hours in a very sunny location, of course, you have to protect yourself. You can use shade and clothing. Of course, it doesn't have to be some kind of sunscreen or tanning oil. But if you must use those, if you use something like carrot seed oil, you can have excellent results without worrying about any toxicity. If you actually look carefully at the data for malignant melanoma, it seems that the evidence more likely points to the conclusion that sunscreens actually cause melanoma rather than protect you from it. So it's important to avoid those products. Toothpaste, we don't actually need it all, but there are plenty of natural alternatives or much less harmful alternatives like you might find on the Healthy Living app I mentioned earlier. Soap is a big thing. Now, you don't need soap, and there are other substances if you need a substance to help you wash, like clay and rice bran, that can absorb dirts and oils and things off your skin. But really, water is actually adequate. Essential oils can be used in place of deodorants or perfumes, and you can mix those with a safe carrier oil, like it could be carrot oil, almond oil, jojoba oil, or a few others, including things like beef tallow and beeswax can be used in a variety of skin products, such as lotions, right, which is another thing, which you can make yourself and find recipes, or there are some manufacturers who make some harmless natural versions. I talked a bit about indoor air pollution, so I think it's critical to have a good quality air purifier. I use the Austin air purifier where you change the filter element every 5 years, and it does make a huge difference. I mean, even if I have burned incense or done things like that, it gets rid of those odors completely. Now, you may not want to run it while you're burning incense, but know that it won't be a permanent smell if you're using a good air filter like that. Laundry detergent and really all household cleaners, you need to think about alternatives, and I'll give you a cleaning recipe a little bit later. But baking soda makes a great laundry detergent. You may not get out certain stains like grease stains and such, but you can pre-treat those with hydrogen peroxide or Castile soap and handle all your laundry situations naturally. Soap nuts, which I don't know a lot about, but they are essentially some kind of seed or fruit from a plant that has some emulsifying and cleaning substances in it. And clothing, I think, is very important to pay attention to and to try to use only natural fiber in the garments that are making direct contact with your skin at a minimum. And you need to pre-wash these even because they may have finishing chemicals, or if it's cotton that's not organic, for example, it's grown with a lot of pesticides. So washing it a couple of times before you wear it can mitigate that substantially, but definitely want to stay away from synthetic fiber clothings that touch your skin. So here's my recipe for an all-purpose cleaner that really works on every surface except possibly for fine wood, where I would just use a damp cloth like a microfiber or a cotton cloth. But this is simply water, and you want to use purified water because it has more dissolving capacity. And you are going to go 50-50 with water and regular white distilled vinegar, the industrial type, and add several drops of your favorite essential oil. Now, I find that citrus oils are very good for cleaning, but you can certainly do your own research and pick your preferred essential oil. I pour these right into the spray bottle, give it a little swirl, and it's good to go for everything. Now, you can mix up a larger batch if you want to use it to clean and mop the floors, for example. It's very inexpensive and very good at cleaning up virtually everything. Okay, I want to point out this resource because we're going to briefly cover outdoor air pollution. And this is from ProPublica, and it's an interactive map that is updated. I believe it's still active, and you can see the URL here. And you can find essentially places where there are dangerous carcinogens in the air pollution. And most of these are the exhaust from industrial factories and other kinds of industrial facilities. And it sort of gives you a color map, and then it gives you specific information about the facilities, where they're located, what your proximity is, and such. So it's a very good resource, and you can see that it's quite overwhelming, the degree of things that we're exposed to. So I talked a little bit about clothing, which contain plasticizing chemicals, but also solvents and forever chemicals like PFAS and such. So have to be very careful about things that are water resistant or waterproof, for example, because the chemicals used to make those are definitely a hazard. Also, perhaps be careful about certain dyes and finishing chemicals, flame retardants, for example, in children's pajamas. It was for a time very common to spray them with flame retardant chemicals, and now they make them tighter fit, so they're less likely to catch on fire rather than use those chemicals. But you want to, if you get any hand-me-downs, so you definitely want to check on that. So there are definitely a lot of risks related to clothing. Also, the FDA is well aware of chemicals, heavy metals, and pesticides, specifically in food, and has specific guidelines for that, as if it's acceptable to have any of these substances in our food supply. And on the next slide, it lists some of the known contaminants, which are things that we know are very dangerous. Benzene is a strong carcinogen. It's associated strongly with leukemia. We know dioxins and PCBs, dioxins not allowed to be used anymore, but it persists in the environment. Perchlorates, PFAS, forever chemicals, radioactive substances, and many more. There's this huge problem of biosolids. And these are essentially waste products that are manufactured into agricultural products from sewage treatment plants. And it turns out that the sewage that goes into sewage treatment plants is not just what's in our waste, which also has many contaminants because of our toxic lifestyles. These things get in our bodies and they come out in our feces and urine and go into the sewer. But it turns out that the EPA actually allows and encourages manufacturing facilities and other industrial operations to dump their poisonous chemical waste right into the sewer. And sewers are not designed to remove chemicals, only biological contaminants. So this is a huge problem, and it's essentially spread on agricultural land and gets into the food supply. And all the classes of problematic chemicals I mentioned are present in these biosolids, including a few I haven't mentioned yet, but will. Speaking of herbicides, we definitely have heard of glyphosate, which has been banned by the European Union, but here it's in food that's recommended to be given to babies. And the next slide, the World Health Organization has declared it a probable carcinogen, and that's, I'm sure, just one of the many toxicities resultant from glyphosate. So artificial sweeteners, of which there are many, and one thing about these is that they don't help us break our sugar addiction. They actually perpetuate our taste for sweet foods. And in many studies, they've shown to be actually more harmful than the sugar itself. Now, Dr. Blaylock is a neurosurgeon who has written quite a bit on this topic and is very concerned. And he essentially points out how some of these chemicals mimic excitatory neurotransmitters, which we're known are associated with several disease states of the brain when they're overactive. And these include things like monosodium glutamate, the flavor enhancer, and aspartame, which is NutraSweet. And there's substantial evidence of developmental disabilities and neuropsychiatric and neurodegenerative disorders associated with these substances. Now, drinking water is another huge source of contaminants. And of course, water is 99 out of 100 molecules in our body and more than 2/3 of our body weight. So it's very critical that we have clean water. So you could see on the next slide that bottled water is not acceptable. Of course, when I was a child and when most of us grew up, we drank tap water. And we didn't even really fill up bottles and carry them around. Like when I was playing sports at my friend's house or whatever, and we were thirsty, we just drank right out of the hose, right? And we never gave it a second thought. And then I'm not sure that that water was safe then, but we really didn't know. And then all of a sudden, they start saying, oh, you can't really drink tap water. You need to drink bottled water. But this was really a trick because the bottled water is not clean by any stretch of the imagination. So I just want to point out that just in drinking water, there are, in addition to the plasticizing chemicals from that bottle, in tap water and other sources of drinking water, there are a variety of toxins. And these can include heavy metals. It's a lot of agricultural runoff chemicals, pesticides and herbicides. Also, there may be waste products from intestinal bacteria that could contaminate the water. There are other types of volatile organics from industrial waste and air pollution that make their way into the drinking water supply. And of course, microplastics, which are quite pervasive in even natural water sources. So this is, quite an important issue because we take a lot of water into our bodies. So we need to make sure that we have purified water. Definitely distillation and reverse osmosis will remove all of those chemicals for sure. Okay, now we can talk about radiation. Now, I'm not going to focus a lot on radiation that would be from Wi-Fi or cell phones or 5G or smart meters, but all of these things are hazardous, but I haven't seen strong evidence that they are causing serious illness yet, but they definitely can cause problems, and you should minimize and mitigate your exposure. And you could do that by, of course, not having these transmitting devices near you. Turn off your Wi-Fi, use a hard Ethernet connection to your computer, or at least turn it off at night. If you put plants between you and the source of the radiation, that will offer some protection. And definitely don't have any devices in your bedroom near you when you're sleeping, unless they are shielded by a special kind of Faraday cage device. I'm really emphasizing ionizing radiation. This is radioactivity. And of course, there is, background radiation that we're exposed to all the time that's, said to come from space, but we can definitely measure it and detect it. But what I'm talking about here really is additional exposure, and not referring to the people, who lived near a nuclear plant accident. I'm talking really about medical exposure. And this is a very underreported but serious issue, especially with respect to cancer, but also with other adverse health outcomes, that medical imaging studies are a substantial cause of health problems. And CT scans are perhaps the worst culprit because your exposure to radiation is much, much higher than a simple plain X-ray. But even ultrasounds can potentially cause health problems. So we need to be very careful to minimize our exposure to medical imaging. And of course, that's not the only aspect of medicine that is a problem for our health. Now, many of you may be familiar with this famous study from Johns Hopkins published in the British Medical Journal stating that more than 250,000 deaths a year in the US are due to medical errors. Now, this would, according to the CDC's leading cause of death, put this at the number 3 cause of death. But that's not the only data. If we see the next slide, also pharmaceuticals, even when taken as directed, would be also the third leading cause of death. Now, if we took half of those in this study who took the doses correctly, in other words, there was no medical error, and added it to the 250,000 from the previous study, we would then find that it was the number one leading cause of death in the United States is medical treatment. Okay, now this study here is different from one published in JAMA that I've mentioned before, because this included chemotherapy and vaccine, whereas the previous study did not include those. So the numbers are substantially higher. Okay, so I wanted to highlight a particular pharmaceutical that is somewhat controversial. And in fact, I had a little discussion about this when I was in Mexico that some of you may have seen or heard about, but I'm talking about ivermectin here. So, in case any of you thought this was a good idea or could help in some way, let me say that I've reviewed all of the clinical evidence and it is not beneficial for any kind of respiratory disease. But here is some real world examples from Oregon, okay, after people started taking it prophylactically for, COVID. Some of them got really sick and they weren't taking overdoses, okay? They reported the exact doses and these were the normal doses, and you could see that people were admitted to the hospital and some of them were put in intensive care, okay, just from taking a regular preventive dose of ivermectin. And you could see that some of the issues, right, were essentially delirium, which has a very high mortality. So these folks are lucky that none of them died in this cohort. Ataxia, that is the inability to walk. Okay, so that is quite significant. And that's when it's described that way, it means it's neurologic. So you can see that this was, quite significant and not a safe medication. I wanted to get into a little bit of how do we connect that we've been exposed to all these substances and the particular health outcomes. Now, clearly, we can see that quite easily when it comes to medical treatment, but what about these environmental toxins? So there is a growing body of research literature where they're looking at actually organs and tissues of humans and possibly animals in some studies and saying, are these environmental chemicals present? So here is a paper about adipose tissue. Now, that's another word for our fat tissue. And that is really important because it contains a lot of fat. So the toxic substances that are not water soluble can be stored there. They're compatible with these cells. And this is exactly what they found. And here they have a little eponym for them, right? POPs, which stands for persistent organic pollutants. Sorry, that is an acronym. But they talk about different classes of compounds, including PCBs, dioxins, furans, PBDEs, and PBBs, right, which are polybrominated biphenyls, and then some other compounds. So these things get stored in the fat tissue, right? And this may actually be helpful to some degree because it keeps them away from more vital organs, right? You wouldn't want it to be stored in your heart muscle, in your brain, in your kidneys. However, there is physiology that's going on in the adipose tissue, right? And it's mostly related to metabolism. So there's some convincing evidence that these toxins in the fat tissue actually disrupt some of the fat metabolism. So, for example, the mechanisms that regulate your body weight, right? The degree of obesity or losing the fat, also with respect to your appetite and your glucose metabolism. So these are quite significant. Microplastics is something else that's been looked at, and it's been found in various places, including the stool for one place. So it's good that our body's getting rid of some of it, or perhaps that is our microplastics we just swallowed and they never got absorbed, but also been found in the placenta, lungs, liver, in the sputum, which is the fluid we cough up, breast milk, and blood. So does not bode well that it is so pervasive, but you can see that we don't know exactly the role it causes in illness and health yet, but I think we can all imagine that it's probably not very good for us to be in all of those tissues. Okay, so to summarize what I've talked to you about today, that we're exposed to quite a lot of things that are not good for us. And I really only covered the tip of the iceberg because each year there are up to 80,000 new chemicals that are put out into the environment, or many of them are new. And when these chemicals are first used, they do not generally get any kind of testing on the effect that they have on biological organisms. It's not required. And there are categories such as generally regarded as safe that the government has, that many people can just put things in products under that category. And unless there emerges evidence that these things are unsafe that goes noticed and someone acts on it, they can continue to be put out there into the environment and we can be exposed to these things. I think it's quite clear that we have no ability to trust government regulation to take care of our health when it comes to environmental toxins. And, we can really see evidence that they're sort of partnering with industry to allow these companies to essentially make what they want, what they think is profitable, and whatever the consequences of their manufacturing process, they can dispose of those quite easily, efficiently, and cheaply with cooperation from the government, allowing them to pollute and poison us. So, despite the ubiquity of these toxins and the responsibility of the corporations, and especially the medical industry, because they are acting under the preface of supporting our health, yet they're actually, as I stated, there's clear evidence that makes them really the leading cause of death. So, despite all these issues, you can actually make a huge difference for yourself and your family, arming yourself, first of all, with information. So, read, look at MSDSs and many other forms of information. Minimize your exposure, okay, not just to consumer products and things you do around your house, but how you interact with other industries. Sometimes this can be really disturbing and in your face, and you don't even know what to do. And I'll give you an example. When I was recently traveling to Mexico, actually, this happened on both directions. In the Mexico City airport, there was an individual, with credentials, airport credentials. I don't remember exactly what they said, who was wearing like a hazmat type suit and had a tank on his back and a sprayer. And he was going around spraying people's luggage, surfaces, like right next to people without asking permission or saying anything, just going around. And the people were just kind of like acting like it was a normal day. And, some folks asked the staff, like, what about it? Isn't it harmful? And they were like, oh, no, it's perfectly safe. But then why is the person spraying it wearing a hazmat suit if it's safe? And when the airport staff were asked that, they said that it makes people feel more secure. So I'm not sure what kind of world we're in when someone having to wear extreme safety equipment, right, makes us feel safe. But we have to overcome this. So, when we're in environments like that, where if we have to travel, we don't want our freedoms limited, we have to take some measures to make sure that, we keep ourselves clean and regularly detox, so that something like that won't throw us over the threshold into a serious health problem. And of course, if we identify anything like that, stay as far away from it as possible and pay attention to any effects that it may have on your health so you can take brisk action. So, this all goes to minimizing exposure and taking responsibility for these aspects. And then, no matter what we do, we can't avoid some exposure to these things if we're living in this world. So, we have to be responsible enough to carry out regular periodic detox operations. I always do some form of detox in the early spring, usually a fast, which could be 3 days or 7 days. One year I did a really long one, but there are many other things. Sometimes will do a week or two of the liver protocol with coffee enemas. Sometimes I do it with juicing. But there are many, many other ways that you can do periodic fasting. I encourage you just to have some plan where you do it periodically on an ongoing basis to make sure that you can really get these things out of your body and not have any, hint of illness affecting your health and vitality. Even if you're doing your best to live clean, you're still being exposed. From off-gassing furniture and plastics in your food to synthetic fibers, personal care products, and even medical imaging procedures, especially fat-soluble chemicals. These toxins don't respond to your average detox. They settle deep in your tissues, and you need the right tools to clear them out. That's why I created the Ultimate Detox Protocol, a free 30-day roadmap that teaches you a serious nature-based detox using pine, targeted nutrition, and a focused daily plan. You'll choose the cleansing diet that fits your needs, support your elimination pathways, and take action against the toxin load that's been holding you back. Many people who've done this protocol have reported major improvements in energy, focus, digestion, and even long-standing symptoms they thought they'd have to live with forever. Unfortunately, I can't share the full scope of results people have experienced using this protocol, not on this platform. If I did, the video would surely be taken down. But trust me, it is incredibly powerful. Download it for free at the link in the show notes. Your health is your responsibility, and this is the best place to start. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next True Health Report.